So now we're turning into the Maslach article. If you read the summary, we decided it's not a hypothesis testing situation. This article is actually an article in the field of psychometrics. In the field of psychometrics, we try to develop reliable and valid scales. Do you guys use scales for your studies? Do you want those scales to be good scales? So should I just create questions and say, here's my scale? No, that's not how psychologists do it. We want to develop reliable and valid scales. That is the field that we call psychometrics. And they're used in OT, PT, PAs. Many times they emanate from psychology fields. It's called the field of psychometrics, where we try to develop reliable and valid scales. And she was trying to do that for what concept in 1981? Burnout. Had people really heard of burnout in 1981? Not so much. Are people in healthcare very familiar with the concept of burnout now? Oh my God, are you kidding me? I worked at Jefferson College of Health Science for 10 years. I heard from a lot of the PT and OT faculty. This job is driving me absolutely nuts, faculty or people actually doing it, that now you don't get to see patients for half the time. You're getting paid half the amount of money. You have to see 4 times as many people. Do all these things lead to burnout? Yes, very much the case. So this article is in the field of psychometrics, where you're trying to establish scales for burnout. And what I'd like to point your attention to, and I'm going to go down a bit here, is table, see if I can do a page down. Table number, page 102, table number 1. Actually, you guys have hard copies of this thing? I think I might actually have some hard copies. Does anybody need a hard copy of this thing? Sure, why not? You only live once. Everybody else good? So if we look at table number 1 here, what she basically did, and this is a part of the presentation where we talk about developing reliable and valid scales. It's called, what field did I say it's called again? Psychometrics. So I wanted to do, need one?
Yeah, when it comes up on the screen, it's sideways. You can't.
Yeah, I can rotate mine.
Thank you.
Can you rotate yours?
You rotate.
Yeah, it's up here. I didn't know how to do that before. Do you see it up on my screen? Have you got it? Rotate your axis.
There we go.
Do you need one?
No, we're good. We're good.
Okay, so what you basically do is you have to run something called a factor analysis. Are you guys familiar with that term, factor analysis? A factor analysis is an approach where you basically take questions that you think map into the concept of burnout. And that's what Maslach did. She had some previous research, kind of startup stuff, and she basically developed, here's what I think are some questions that really map into the concept of burnout. And what you do is you run a factor analysis. And you have to know how to do a factor analysis by hand? No. Guess what does that for you? SPSS. That's why we like SPSS. Press this button. I don't know. I've never had to run a factor analysis myself. But I did just showed my class back at Mary Baldwin how to do a 2-factor ANOVA by hand. That was a hoot. Sorry, I'm getting
Keith was just asking how to do one of those.
What's that?
Keith was just asking
No,
how
he
to do
wasn't.
one of those.
So I left my glasses up here. I'm sorry, I just don't like to be so far away from all you nice people. Just not used to my constructivist-based ways doing that. So the idea is she came up with all of these statements and she gave them to people, and asked them how they felt on all of these items. She had a scale, I think it was 1 to 5 or 1 to 7 at one point, and she put all of these questions in, and what a factor analysis will do, if you want to take a note or two on this, it could be important for you. What a factor analysis will do is it will identify basically different factors from all these questions that you have. It'll identify various factors from all these questions that you have in your survey. So when she ran this originally, it came up with 4, but really 3 main ones. It came up with 3 factors. And the idea is you have to almost picture a multi-dimensional space of factors, and what you try to do, and if you ever read an article on this, they basically see how each item in the survey might load into various factors. And so if you look at this survey, you'll actually see, we'll find it here. You'll actually see that if you look at the question, I feel emotionally drained from my work. We can see that up there. That seemed to load highly, those first, 7, 8 questions. Which factor did they load highly in under frequency? Which one of the 4 factors does it look like they, and the factor loadings are another word for, does anybody know? Factor loadings are another word for correlations. So instead of saying correlations, we call them factor loadings. A factor loading is how much does a question correlate with a factor. Do you guys know what correlations can range from? 0 to 1 or -1 to +1, but it's not usually negative in a factor analysis. It looks like those first 8 questions, is it 7, is it 8? I think it's 7 actually. They all look like they load highly into which one of these factors? Number 1. So the first 7 questions seem to load highly into factor number 1. What about the next 6 questions? Yeah, it looks like the next 6 questions loaded very highly into factor 2. And then the third 5 or 6 questions loaded highly into what? Factor 3. So that was the factor analysis. The key, though, and the really important part of this, is then you go back and you look at these questions, and if you look at all those questions under Roman numeral 1, do they all look like they kind of have some sort of commonality amongst them? They do, and guess what she called this commonality? It wasn't there before. Go ahead.
Exhaustion.
A good solution in a factor analysis is when it's run and the items that load highly into a factor all seem to have some cohesion with one component. That's how you come up with valid subscales. All of these questions kind of go into her new label, which she called emotional exhaustion. So that is considered a good solution, where your items load highly into one factor. And so one subscale of burnout is emotional exhaustion. Let me ask my table over here. Ladies, do you feel emotionally exhausted? Is it getting worse listening to me yap all the time here? Hopefully, maybe a little bit, maybe not. Okay, so she called the first subscale emotional exhaustion. You do the same thing with the second subscale. If you look at these questions, what did she call this?
Personal accomplishment.
Personal accomplishment. When people are feeling burned out, how do you think they're doing with personal accomplishment? They're feeling like they're getting absolutely no personal accomplishment from what they're doing. So that's called personal accomplishment. And then the third one, I feel like I'm being treated like I'm an object. I worry that this job is hardening me. I don't really care about what happens. What did she call this subscale? Depersonalization. So we kind of have, this is considered a good article. It's in the field of psychometrics where you come up with good subscales that really map into something meaningful. Now, if the items in Roman numeral 1 included items for number 3, that wouldn't be a good factor analysis because then you'd kind of have a hodgepodge of things. But this was the original research. Would you need to replicate this a bunch? Like when we do our science experiments, we need to replicate, don't we? Would you need to replicate this a lot? No, this was pretty much it. And other people did replicate it, but this was running it the right way and showing that we have 3 subscales. So a factor analysis is a way of psychometrically coming up with subscales. And this article does a nice job of showing a factor analysis and coming up with subscales. You guys have comments or questions for me about this realm and this idea? Yeah, a lot of people have used burnout as a very useful concept.